Hey everyone, welcome back to Dopamania TV, where curiosity meets storytelling. And if you like mysteries that tingle your spine and make you want to check your locks twice, then stick around and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives like this. Today, we step into the lamplight and fog of late 19th century London to walk down the narrow alleys and imagine a city that could seem both familiar and terrifying. This is a narrative about Jack the Ripper, Victorian London's nightmare, a story that has haunted streets, books, films, and late-night conversations for more than a century. We will tell what happened, and then pause to examine how a small number of crimes grew into one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history, and why the case still captures the imagination today. I'll try to keep it clear and human, and I'll be careful with the details. We will describe events and evidence without dwelling on explicit gore, because the human tragedy is what matters, not sensationalism. Let's step back in time to a London of gaslight and horse hooves, a city of splendid public buildings and shivering alleys, where progress rubbed shoulders with grinding poverty, and a growing population put immense pressure on housing, jobs, and public services. Picture a winter of 1888. A city of more than 5 million people, teeming with new inventions and old problems. Along the eastern edge of the city, the East End stretched with narrow streets, backward alleys, yards, and lodging houses. Whitechapel was at the heart of this dense urban maze, a place of markets, small workshops, pubs, and a very visible population of women who survived by selling sex, begging, or working in households. Streets could be crowded by day and eerily quiet by night. And then imagine a series of attacks that would turn this part of London into the focus of an international frenzy. The story most people know begins in the late summer and autumn of 1888, when a string of murders was discovered in and around Whitechapel. The victims are often named and remembered, and for good reason. Each was an ordinary woman with her own life, struggles, and relationships. And each death was a tragedy. The names that remain in the public record include Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. We will speak of them with respect, and will try to reconstruct their lives in some detail so they are not only names on a page. Mary Ann Nichols was found in the early morning of August 31, 1888, lying in Bucks Row, a narrow lane near Hanbury Street. She was 47. And her life had been difficult. She had spent years working intermittently as a laundress and hawking fruit and flowers. She had struggled with alcohol and had been separated from her husband. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through Whitechapel and beyond. And it marked the beginning of a string of killings that would terrify the city. The police and the public were unsettled by the unconscionable violence of the attack, and by the fact that someone could walk the streets at night and commit such a crime and disappear into the fog. Less than a month later, on September 8, 1888, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a small cottage in Hanbury Street. Annie had lived a hard life. She was 47, and she had worked as a domestic servant and a casual laborer at times. Like Mary Ann, she had personal troubles and dependence on alcohol. Her death deepened the fear and bewilderment in the city. Both of these early victims were poor and vulnerable, and their deaths prompted the police to consider whether a single killer might be responsible. On the night of September 30, an apparent interruption in the killing spree made headlines. Elizabeth Stride, sometimes called Long Liz, was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. She had been out late and was discovered early in the morning. That same night, just about an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, in the City of London, a short walk from the border between the city and Whitechapel. The coincidence of two bodies found within such a short time and distance caused confusion and fierce debate among investigators and the public. Some thought that both were the work of the same person, others that two killers were active. or that one individual had struck twice in a single night. The deaths of Stride and Eddowes made the case even more urgent, and they pushed police resources, including the Metropolitan Police and City of London Police, into intense action. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found in her room at Miller's Court on November 9, 1888. She was 25, and she had lived a precarious life, often moving from lodging to lodging. Her death was different in many ways from the earlier murders because it occurred indoors, in private. And it was discovered by a neighbor and a lodging housekeeper who entered her room when she failed to respond to knocks. Mary Jane Kelly's death became the most notorious, and it resonated strongly in the press and public imagination. Those murders between late August and early November are usually described as the Whitechapel murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. Why Jack the Ripper? The nickname emerges from letters sent to police and newspapers at the time. Some were obviously hoaxes meant to play into public fear, but one famous letter, called the Dear Boss letter, contained the name Jack the Ripper and was received by the Central News Agency and forwarded to the police. A spokesperson for the Metropolitan Police later announced that the nickname was being used in the press. And it stuck. Whether the notorious letters came from the killer is still debated, but the name created a persona, a figure who could be feared and imagined beyond the streets of Whitechapel. This is a story not only about the crimes themselves, but about a city struggling to manage modernity, about a poor and often ignored population, about the police system of the time, and about the press. Let's think about the environment where the killings occurred. The East End had been shaped by industrial growth and by the arrival of migrants and travelers who could not afford decent housing. Tenements and lodging houses were overcrowded. Many people lived in workhouses or relied on charity. Prostitution was both visible and widely tolerated as an economic reality, even while many condemned it publicly. Between legal norms, official indifference, and the need to survive, many women in Whitechapel were exposed to danger every day. Policing in 1888 was also different from what most people imagine today. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829, had grown into a complex organization. Detectives were still developing techniques and standards that we now assume are basic, like securing scenes, preserving evidence, and documenting witness statements. The relationship between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police was sometimes fraught. Differing jurisdictions meant that coordination could be awkward. The forensic methods available in the late 19th century were limited. There were no modern DNA tests, no electronic databases, and photography was still a developing tool for identification. The coroner's inquests provided public investigations of violent deaths, but they could only go so far without reliable forensic science. The press played a monumental role in shaping public opinion and, in a sense, inflaming it. Newspapers competed for sensational headlines, and Whitechapel became a marketable nightmare. Stories about the killings sold papers and sold fear. Street newspapers and broadsides offered lurid details and speculation. And that fed into rumors and panic. Crowds gathered at crime scenes and in the neighborhoods where police worked, and the public often crowded the inquest hearings. The press also aimed an accusatory finger at institutions and classes, blaming the poor for their own misfortunes or attacking the police for incompetence. This environment created pressure on investigators to find a suspect quickly, and that pressure led to mistakes, hasty arrests, and misdirected focus. We need to pause and consider how memory, rumor, and evidence interact. So many stories and theories have accumulated that it's easy to lose sight of the facts that can be supported by contemporary records. Over the decades, a fog of myth has settled over the Whitechapel murders. For instance, we often hear that the killer had surgical skill because of the condition of some victims, and that led to theories about doctors, surgeons, and medical students. But careful historians and criminologists have pointed out that while anatomical knowledge may have influenced some interpretations, many of the assumptions about skill are exaggerated by sensational reporting and hindsight bias. The rush to attribute certain knowledge to the killer might reflect cultural anxiety about science and medicine as much as real evidence. It's also important to recognize the lives of the victims beyond what happened to them. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly had friends, family, acquaintances, and histories. They were part of a community where women often formed support networks despite hardship. Reconstructing their lives helps restore dignity and human context to a story that is otherwise frequently told as a catalog of violence. Biographers and social historians have done important work in reconstructing their backgrounds. Looking at census records, coroner reports, and living testimony from the time, those accounts show how ordinary lives could be disrupted by poverty, family breakdown, and social stigma. Now let's move to the investigation itself. The Metropolitan Police, under enormous pressure, deployed officers to the area and drew on detectives to interview dozens of witnesses. There were many leads, some plausible, others wild. The police received letters from people claiming to be witnesses, confessors, or simply voyeurs. Some witnesses reported seeing suspicious men or hearing strange noises near the times of the murders, and police compiled long lists of persons of interest. Detectives interviewed lodging house owners, street vendors, watchmen, and neighbors. Some suspects were arrested, questioned, and released. The scale of the inquiry was massive for the time. One notable aspect of the police response was the deployment of extra patrols and the attempt to establish a visible presence to reassure the public. Plainclothes men were placed in the area, and mounted patrols and beat constables increased. Yet even with increased patrols, the killer seemed able to move through the streets undetected. Some modern readers wonder how that could be, and the answer lies partly in the nature of policing, partly in under-resourced forces, and partly in the mundane reality that a city of millions is difficult to police completely, especially in poor, overcrowded neighborhoods where residents might be reluctant to speak freely to officers. Many names have been proposed as suspects over the years. Some of them were contemporary suspects named by the police. Others emerged later as investigators, writers, and amateur sleuths analyzed the evidence and invented theories. The suspect list reads like a cross-section of Victorian London: ordinary laborers, watchmen, alleged doctors, barbers, and even people with artistic or literary ambitions. The famous theories that implicate high-status figures, like royalty or aristocrats, come from a later era of conspiracy thinking and sensationalism. Such theories can be captivating because they tie the crimes to secret worlds of power, but they often rely on flimsy or manufactured evidence. We should separate conjecture from what evidence suggests. One contemporary suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant barber living in Wojtek who was later placed in an asylum. Police opinions varied. Some officers remembered him as an obnoxious man with a hatred of women, while others thought him harmless. Later investigators have pointed to circumstantial evidence and to notes in police files that might link him to the killings. Another candidate often discussed is Montague John Druitt, a lawyer and teacher who committed suicide shortly after the final canonical murder. He was named in police correspondence as a suspect based on a combination of timing, rumors of his behavior, and later interpretations. Then there is Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who had a history of hostility toward women and who left England abruptly during the murders. The list goes on. A variety of individuals have been suggested, each with reasons for suspicion, and each with counterarguments that point to innocence. Modern investigators have used new tools to analyze old evidence. For example, forensic advances and DNA techniques have been applied to letters, to stamps, and to alleged artifacts linked to the crimes. Sometimes such analyses produce headline-grabbing claims, and sometimes they collapse under scrutiny. The problem is that evidence was rarely collected with modern standards in mind. Items were handled by many people and preserved in ways that introduce contamination. Hairs, fibers, and stains are difficult to trace conclusively after more than a century. That does not mean modern science is irrelevant, but it does mean we must be careful with claims that a DNA test from an old shawl or a letter has definitively solved the case. The chain of custody and the provenance of objects can be murky. Another interesting thread is the role of false leads and hoaxes. Many letters sent to police and newspapers claiming to be from the killer were later judged to be hoaxes, done for attention or to frighten readers. These hoaxes increased the public's anxiety and distracted investigators. The Dear Boss letter that introduced the Jack the Ripper name, and the so-called From Hell letter that accompanied a small package and gruesome claims, are part of this story. Some investigators over the decades have tried to authenticate certain letters based on handwriting analysis or postal marks, but the effort often leads to disagreement. The hoaxes highlight how a sensational case can spawn imitators and opportunists eager to manipulate public fear. We should also look at how the killers may have chosen victims. Many criminologists point out that the victims were vulnerable, often working the streets at night, and sometimes had problems with alcohol or personal instability. The killer's choices may have been opportunistic. He sought women who were alone at night and could be easily isolated. That is not an explanation of motive, but it helps to reconstruct how the crimes might have been accomplished. The idea that the killer operated with clinical precision, stalking victims like a surgeon might, has been exaggerated in popular accounts. Instead, evidence suggests a mixture of opportunity, impulsiveness, and perhaps some knowledge of local routines. The impact on the people living in Whitechapel was enormous. Fear spread, and the community responded in different ways. Some residents tried to change behaviors, finding safer ways to move at night or limiting their outings. Others organized patrols, community meetings, and fundraising to help vulnerable women. Charities and social reformers used the murders to press for changes in housing, sanitation, and employment opportunities, arguing that poverty created conditions of vulnerability. The deaths spurred debates about morality and social policy, including whether stricter policing or more social programs would prevent similar tragedies. One of the most enduring elements of the Jack the Ripper story is how it captured the cultural imagination. Writers and artists were fascinated by the contrast between the city's glittering surface and the darkness of its back alleys. The Ripper came to symbolize urban danger and the gap between wealth and poverty. The case was an early example of a modern media spectacle, combining sensational reporting, amateur detectives, and a public appetite for dramatic narratives about crime. Over the 20th century and into the 21st, the story has been retold in novels, films, television documentaries, and podcasts, each version reshaping the image of the killer to fit the concerns of the age. The myth-making around Jack the Ripper shows how historical events can be reshaped by storytelling. Fictional accounts emphasize mystery and suspense, and often fill gaps in the historical record with imagination. At the same time, serious historians and criminologists have worked to separate myth from fact. They have combed archives, compared reports, and tried to understand the social context of Whitechapel. That interplay of scholarship and storytelling is itself part of the reason the case endures. It invites both emotional engagement and analytical curiosity. Let's return to the police and their investigations in more depth. After the first murders, the head of the Metropolitan Police appointed detectives to the case, and different divisions worked to coordinate efforts. The investigating officers faced obstacles such as overwhelmed local stations, a lack of systematic forensic methods, and the public's expectations. Witness statements were inconsistent, memories of shocked neighbors often conflicted. Time passed between the times of death and discovery, which made accurate timelines difficult. The coroner's inquests provided crucial official records that compiled witness testimony, medical examinations, and narratives of events. And these inquests were covered widely by the press. The medical officers who examined the bodies gave evidence about the probable time of death and the nature of the wounds without going into gratuitous detail. Their testimony shaped how the police understood the crimes and whether they could be linked. The public also pressured politicians and law enforcement officials. Members of parliament and local authorities demanded action, and debates in the newspapers accused the police of incompetence or indifference. That political pressure produced both reactionary measures and calls for more humane policies. Some commentators used the murders to demand stricter moral policing of vice. Others insisted that social problems like poor housing needed real reforms. The varying reactions show a society wrestling with complex underlying issues that a criminal case only made more visible. The role of the coroner is worth a deeper look because coroners' inquests were public and often highly dramatized. The coroner would assemble witnesses, examine medical evidence, and return verdicts that could be critical to public understanding of a death. In the Ripper cases, the inquests became a kind of public theater where witnesses, police officers, and medical examiners testified under cross-examination, and newspapers transcribed these proceedings. In some cases, the coroner's juries returned verdicts of murder and implicated persons unknown. The inquests recorded the community's horror and attempted to impose an official narrative on chaotic events, but they could not produce a conviction without a suspect and a trial. Now let's talk about evidence. At the time, photographs of crime scenes were taken, which was still a relatively recent development in police work. Police notebooks and statements documented witness accounts. Some physical items were collected and logged. Although by today's standards the collection and preservation were inconsistent, relics and personal effects associated with victims later surfaced in private collections and in museums, but the provenance of those items is often uncertain. For modern researchers, the problem is that evidence can rarely be analyzed with the kind of scientific rigor that would meet contemporary standards for criminal proof. That leaves historians relying on a patchwork of documents, witness statements, and later recollections. In the years after the murders, there were many arrests and a number of trials for other crimes. Some arrests involved individuals connected to the area and to suspicious behavior. Others were clearly political or social victims of the panic, rounded up because of racial prejudice, or because migrants were considered suspect. The police sometimes cast a wide net that caught innocent people. This aspect of the investigation reminds us that panic and fear can damage social cohesion and lead to miscarriages of justice. A powerful aspect of the Ripper story is how it reveals the gendered nature of vulnerability in Victorian cities. Women who worked as prostitutes or who were otherwise marginalized were exposed to specific dangers that middle and upper-class women experienced less often. That difference is not only a matter of individual choices, but also of social structures. Employment opportunities were limited, social services sparse, and stigma often prevented women from receiving help. The public debates about the murders sometimes closed ranks against the victims, casting them as morally suspect, while other voices argued for compassion and change. The violence of the crimes forced a re-examination of public attitudes toward poverty and gender. As decades passed, the Jack the Ripper story moved from contemporary horror into legend. Early 20th century writers began to produce more speculative accounts, and the case acquired layers of cultural meaning. In the 1970s and later, amateur investigators began to catalog suspects and to claim discoveries based on new interpretations of old evidence. Academic historians, meanwhile, pursued the social history angle. What did the killings reveal about urban poverty, policing, and the social order? Both approaches contributed to a richer understanding of the case, but also to more competing narratives about who the killer might have been and why the crimes were never solved. In recent years, the Ripper case has been examined with modern forensic techniques, including DNA analysis. Some studies claim to find genetic traces linking individuals to letters or to articles of clothing. But these claims are subject to intense scrutiny. Old documents and textiles are easily contaminated by many hands over the years, and without a clear chain of custody, DNA findings can be ambiguous. Still, new techniques have generated renewed interest, and even if they do not produce absolute answers, they highlight how scientific tools can be applied to historical mysteries. The caveat is always the same. The past was messy, and evidence gathered in an ad hoc manner a century ago cannot easily be subjected to modern evidentiary standards. The enduring fascination with Jack the Ripper also reveals something about our modern relationship to crime narratives. We live in an era saturated with true crime podcasts, documentaries, and forums where amateur sleuths debate clues. The Ripper story predates modern media, but already showed many of the same dynamics. A voracious public appetite for details, a sensationalist press, amateur detectives, conspiracy theories, and the social need to make sense of sudden, shocking violence. The case invites us to consider how we consume stories about victimhood and villains, and how empathy can sometimes be displaced by morbid curiosity. Another interesting angle is how the Ripper story influenced policing and investigative techniques. The inability to catch the killer exposed weaknesses in coordination, scene preservation, and investigative methods. Over time, policing evolved, adopting better record-keeping, more systematic crime scene procedures, and a growing reliance on scientific methods. In that way, tragic and high-profile crimes can sometimes catalyze institutional improvements, as law enforcement seeks to avoid repeating past failures. Public memory of Jack the Ripper has also had a tangible presence in London. Tours of Whitechapel and the East End are popular, drawing tourists who want to see the actual streets connected to the murders. Museums and exhibits present artifacts, photographs, and documents. Yet such tours and exhibits come with ethical dilemmas. How do we remember violent crimes respectfully? How do we ensure that the victims are not exploited for entertainment? Thoughtful curators and tour guides attempt to balance public interest with sensitivity, emphasizing social context, the lives of the victims, and the importance of historicizing the events. Interestingly, the Ripper story has also intersected with politics and public reform movements. Some reformers used the murders to advocate for changes in housing and labor laws, arguing that preventing such vulnerabilities would require structural improvements. Others turned the case into a moralistic platform, arguing for stricter control of vice. The conversation that followed the murders shows how tragic events become lenses through which societies debate broader issues. So why does the Jack the Ripper case still hold sway? Part of the answer is simple: the killer was never caught. And human beings are wired to seek closure. An unsolved crime leaves a space where imagination and suspicion can fill the void. Another part of the answer is the dramatic contrast between the public face of Victorian progress and the private reality of poverty and danger. The killings forced Londoners and the world to confront that contrast. And finally, the way the press told the story, and the later retellings in literature and film, created a narrative that connects with modern fears about urban anonymity, predatory violence, and the shadow side of rapid social change. The historical record offers some likely possibilities and many uncertainties. A cautious view is that the killer was probably someone local to Whitechapel or the East End with knowledge of the area, and who chose vulnerable victims. He may have had a mental illness or deeply antisocial tendencies, but beyond that, our ability to know the truth is limited. Theories that pin the crimes on high society figures or on convoluted conspiracies are entertaining but rest on shaky foundations. The strength of the evidence lies in the local geography of the crimes, the victimology, and the behavior patterns suggested by witness statements. From a criminological perspective, the killer fits the profile of someone who exploited opportunity and local knowledge in a crowded urban environment. One can also reflect on the moral dimension of the story. The Ripper case invites us to consider how societies treat their most vulnerable members and how social tolerance of inequality can have deadly consequences. The victims were not only victims of an unnamed attacker, but also, in a broader sense, victims of neglect. The response of the police, the press, and the public varied from compassionate to punitive, and that range of reactions tells us about human responses to fear and crisis. Over the decades, the Ripper saga has been repackaged in many forms. Novelists have turned it into thrillers and historical fiction. Filmmakers have reimagined the city in noir, horror, and procedural dramas. Documentarians have tried to separate fact from mythology. Each retelling reflects contemporary anxieties, fears about immigration, worries about urban crime, or fascination with forensic breakthroughs. The story's elasticity is remarkable, and that elasticity ensures its longevity. If you're a curious viewer and want to dig into primary sources, there are resources that present the coroner's reports, police files, and contemporary newspaper coverage. Scholars have sifted through those sources and written careful biographies of victims and rigorous studies of the social conditions in Whitechapel. Visiting archives, reading original accounts, and comparing interpretations are great ways to encounter the historical record directly. I should warn you, though, as with any famous case subject to myth, you'll find contradictions, partisan interpretations, and gaps that will drive you to form your own view. Now, let's imagine for a moment the experience of a Whitechapel resident in 1888. You live in a narrow court or a crowded boarding house. Nights are lit by dim gas lamps, and the fog thickens with coal smoke. You hear the distant clang of carts and the occasional shout from a pub. At such a time, the news that a killer stalks the streets is terrifying. You might stay indoors or band together with neighbors. Or you might become one of the many who simply continue to work, because survival allows little room for fear. That human element, the way ordinary people coped with terror and kept living, is often overlooked in sensational accounts that focus only on the figure of the killer. The Ripper case also invites reflection on how we assign blame and how quickly we look for villains in times of crisis. Police investigators made judgments with limited information, and the public made judgments too, often guided by prejudice. Immigrants, the mentally ill, and the poor were prime targets of suspicion. That tendency shows us how a society under stress can turn on its vulnerable members rather than address underlying problems. It's instructive to think about the global reach of the case. European and American newspapers followed the events closely, and Jack the Ripper became an international symbol of urban horror. For some foreign observers, the murders confirmed stereotypes about British decadence or the risks of industrialization. For others, the story was an object lesson about modernity's costs. This global response shows how a local crime can take on symbolic meaning far beyond its immediate setting. So where does that leave us today? The simple answer is that we still do not know who Jack the Ripper was. Some credible theories point to individuals who had opportunity and motive. But there remains no definitive proof. The lack of resolution is both frustrating and compelling. It keeps historians and enthusiasts returning to the archives, to the maps, and to the quiet corners of old courts where these women once walked. The lasting lesson, perhaps, is less about catching an elusive figure than about remembering the victims and understanding the social conditions that made such tragedy possible. When we read or hear accounts of the Ripper, it helps to keep in mind the real human beings who lived and died, and the public institutions that then struggled to respond. If the story teaches us anything useful, it is to deepen our empathy for victims of crime and to remind us that social neglect exacerbates vulnerability. Over the decades, museums and local historians in London have tried to commemorate the victims thoughtfully, sometimes with plaques or historical displays. These efforts aim to move beyond sensational storytelling and to present the events in an educational context. That shift signals a growing recognition that public history has ethical responsibilities, to avoid turning suffering into entertainment, to honor victims, and to educate visitors about the social history of the city. Before we finish, let's run through some of the most discussed suspects and the main reasons they have been proposed, and then add a note on how to view such claims critically. Aaron Kosminski is one of the more discussed names because police notes later suggested a suspect of Polish origin with mental illness who lived in Whitechapel. Montague John Drute earned suspicion because his suicide coincided with the end of the murders. Francis Tumblety was a flamboyant American quack doctor whose behavior made him a suspect. Other names include a variety of local laborers and itinerants, and even people with marginal occupations like barbers or medical students. The common thread in many of these theories is circumstantial evidence, proximity to the crimes, erratic behavior, or historical coincidence. Careful analysis, however, shows that circumstantial similarity is not the same as proof, and in many cases, the evidence is interpretive rather than demonstrative. When you encounter modern books or documentaries claiming to have solved the case, be skeptical. Ask what the evidence is, whether the chain of custody for artifacts is sound, and whether modern forensic claims account for contamination and ambiguous provenance. Often, the most rigorous conclusions are those that admit uncertainty and avoid dramatic proclamations. That's not as exciting as a cinematic reveal, but it's more responsible historically. Finally, it's worth considering what the Ripper legend tells us about storytelling itself. The human mind loves patterns and villains, and unsolved crimes create narratives that can be endlessly retold. The Ripper story is a case study in how a single narrative can become a cultural object, continuously reshaped to meet the needs and anxieties of different eras. Each telling reveals as much about the storyteller's time as about Victorian London. Thank you for staying with me through this long walk down a foggy East End street. If this kind of deep dive into mysteries, history, and the curious corners of the past is your thing, please like and subscribe to Dopamania TV. And ring the bell or follow so you don't miss our next exploration. I try to tell these stories with care, focusing on the human context, and I hope this episode gave you a clearer picture of the Jack the Ripper case, not just as a puzzle to be solved, but as a window into a time, a place, and people whose lives deserve to be remembered. To finish, I'll leave you with something to ponder. Sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not the ones with a single answer, but those that force us to ask hard questions about how societies protect the vulnerable, how institutions respond to crisis, and how memory turns reality into legend. The story of Jack the Ripper is all of those things, and it will likely continue to attract curiosity as long as we are willing to look at its lessons honestly. If you want further reading, I'll recommend a few respectful, scholarly sources that dig into the coroner's reports and the social history of Whitechapel. and which avoid sensationalizing the victims. There are collections of primary documents that present coroners, inquests, and police memoranda. And there are social histories that place the murders in the broader context of Victorian urban life. If you're new to this history, start with thorough accounts that emphasize victims, biographies, and social context rather than detective thrillers that prefer conjecture. For those who want to go deeper, academic journals and archives offer rich, carefully annotated sources. One last thought before we go. The names Jack the Ripper and Whitechapel have come to mean something beyond the literal crimes. They stand for the darker side of city life and the way tragedy can be magnified by fear and rumor. And so the story remains a cautionary tale about empathy and responsible reporting. If we can learn anything from this long tale, it might be the importance of human dignity when confronting horror. That means honoring victims, supporting the vulnerable, and demanding investigations that respect truth over spectacle. Thanks again for watching. Like I said, if you enjoy this kind of careful historical storytelling, hit like, subscribe, and share with friends who love mysteries done with depth. And let me know in the comments what aspect of the Jack the Ripper story you find most compelling: the history, the police work, the social context, or the cultural afterlife. I read your thoughts and I really enjoy seeing the different perspectives. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and remember that history often tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the past.